Hey class, welcome to another week in History 113. Last lecture we saw the role of Jacksonian democracy both benefit American society and then also create crises, particularly through the Mexican-American War and the outflowing of the ideology of manifest destiny. We started to see how slavery was becoming the dominant issue in American politics. It defined the issue of Texas. Some people wanted Texas because slavery could expand through Texas and through the rest of Mexico. And also, you saw people opposed to absorbing new territories, or at least putting some kind of qualifier or ban on slavery being expanded into whatever territory the United States would acquire. So why was this such a big deal, right? As we saw, some people wanted to expand Jacksonian democracy in terms of self-ownership as a citizen. But we also saw that this idea of an agrarian republic, one that was built on free trade, the exchanges of goods, and we'll get into a little bit of that with the philosophy of John C. Calhoun. But this had to do with the issue of cotton, right? I said in a previous lecture, you can't understand American history unless you understand the color green. And you can't understand the American South and the slave system if you don't understand the financial and economic role of cotton, right? So in this lecture, we're going to get into the underpinnings of why did slavery become such an important issue in American politics? How did it define an entire region of the nation? And how did cotton develop global economics, global trade, global markets, in making at least the elite of the South a very wealthy oligarchy? So first, I want to get into a quick recap of the economics of slavery. So as I mentioned before, right, and this especially in week 2 when we talked about the development of the plantation system, if cotton becomes white gold for the 19th century, the previous agricultural cash crop was sugar. The 7 Years' War revolved around control of the sugar islands. The rippling effects of the French Revolution and Saint-Domingue, and then ultimately the independent nation of Haiti, had to do with sugar plantations. The fact that Jamaica remained within the British Empire had to do with sugar, and the fact that South Carolina struggled probably the most of any of the southern states to leave the British Empire and join with its sister colonies in proclaiming an independent nation had to do with slave economy agriculture. So right, South Carolina, if you remember, it began as a depot, as a sort of offshoot of Barbados, which was a main sugar colony. But then South Carolina would develop its own economic stature, and this was in relation to indigo and especially rice. Now, South Carolina if you've ever been there, is a very wet and swampy place, but it's not as swampy the further west you go. Really, only the eastern part of the state is like living in, submerged in water, right? Which is great for rice. But the United States never really had its own sugar areas. The southern tip of Louisiana around the New Orleans area, that's pretty good for sugar, but this was never really tapped into the main trade routes, and the islands in the Caribbean were much better for growing sugar anyway. But sugar was a major cash crop. You could become the equivalent of a billionaire overnight by buying up land and buying up slaves and engaging in the sugar economy. And of course, why does this work this way, right? Because you can do lots and lots and lots of things with sugar. It's not only, if you, it's kind of hard to believe, but right, sugar's in everything, right? But it's also being considered a kind of psychotropic drug by some neuroscientists, meaning sugar actually rewrites the way your brain works at the same level that nicotine and tobacco does. So it has an addictive quality to it. And of course, you can put sugar in just about anything. So it's easy to understand when sugar becomes the refined white crystal stuff that you're used to seeing on, packets on a diner table, or having it in your own cabinet, or being transformed into varieties of other sugars like corn syrups and so on, right? You can put it in just about anything, and therefore you can sell it just about anywhere. Cotton, similar to sugar, right, can be used for lots of different things, but we'll get into all that when we talk about the British economy. Now, we already mentioned South Carolina. South Carolina was unique for a southern state. It was the one state that was least favorable to the Jeffersonian Revolution. South Carolina remained a Federalist bastion, mainly because of the influence of the elites living on the east side of the state, as opposed to the ambitious and newly crowned Cotton Kings to the west of the state. But they became a solid group eventually. But before that, right, just to kind of fill you in a little bit, the east coast of South Carolina, particularly rooted in the capital of Charleston, it was a very cosmopolitan city. They dabbled in high fashion. They were interested in the newest scientific technologies of the day. They were trying, right? Sometimes people will portray the South as this totally backwards society. Sometimes they'll talk about, which is true, that Southern gentlemen wanted to kind of create an aristocracy. They pretended to be lords and ladies. They saw themselves as gentlemen. They built these kind of mansions, these estates that reflected a kind of feudal hangover, and they liked to pretend that they were knights. All of this is true, but it's a product of wealth and science and prestige, right? You can kind of role play, oh, look, we're a gentleman, look, oh, I'm a knight, haha. But in reality, these guys were heavily invested in the newest ideas, the newest technologies of the day. They wanted to know how to grow their crops more efficiently. They wanted to know how to more effectively exploit a labor population, right? And all of this was for the maximization of profit, right? The wealthier you were, the more powerful you could be. The more powerful and wealthier you were, you could kind of set trends, lead countries, etc., right? Money, in a way, is liquid power, and so the more you can acquire, the more you can try to buy your way up the ladder. Now, a lot of Southerners, South Carolinians included, kind of chafed at the way that the British aristocracy worked, which they would take their money and they would go back home, so to speak, back to the motherland, and they'd find themselves somewhat disrespected, right? These are low-born men masquerading as lords and ladies just because they have money. They can't buy their way into high society. So this is a classic story of old money versus new money. So the British landed elite didn't necessarily take too kindly to some of these people, and so they had a chip on their shoulders, which partially explains why some of them were open to American independence, building their own American aristocracy built on slaves and wealth and American manners and customs, and distancing themselves from their British and European cousins. Nevertheless, right, that defines South Carolina society, and it will translate into the Cotton Kingdom as it moves further and further west. Now, another key thing to reflect upon and to think about is how slavery itself changed within the British Empire. So if any of you are familiar with this story, there was a guy named William Wilberforce. He was a very devout evangelical Christian, and he became obsessed, right? I mean, that would be the negative way, but very, very zealous about ending the slave trade within Britain. Britain had already had a series of legal cases that banned slavery from Great Britain itself, but in other parts of the empire, you could still own slaves. And so Wilberforce's crusade ultimately doesn't end slavery throughout the British Empire. It doesn't end in Jamaica for another 3 or 4 decades. But what Wilberforce does is kind of create through his work as a member of the British Parliament, kind of create an ethos that slavery is not acceptable within, a moral or Christian society. So this will sort of set the tone for some evangelicals, but also other moral, humanistic reformers in the north of the United States who become opposed to the slave economy for a variety of different reasons. And we'll get into some of that next week. But the key effect of this is that the British, the Parliament, decides to ban the slave trade, and then the British Navy becomes an international police force to get rid of slavery, right? And so in the United States, right, some people wanted to get rid of the slave trade, but with Britain sort of turning its face decisively against it, making it an illegal action at a international level. American society eventually pulls out, and in the constitutional in the Constitution itself, right, there's a provision for a debate about the end of the slave trade. And under President Jefferson, Congress votes and they ban the slave trade from the United States. Now, you could say, okay, it was already sort of on its way out. How is the U.S. going to compete with Great Britain? Also, there was still a black market in slave trading, right? There's some work about maybe the British Navy wasn't as keen to end the slave trade as they would say they were, and also sometimes would impress basically enslave Africans and say, now you work for the British Navy. So there's a lot of other kind of shady elements to all of this. But at least formally, legally, the United Kingdom turns against the institution of the slave trade. But this doesn't mean, like I said, slavery would go away. Um, we'll get into reform movements when we and a little bit in this lecture talking about the factory system, but UK finance will continue to invest in slavery in other countries. Um, British elites don't become super favorable, at least some of them are not super favorable towards the attitudes of these sort of high-minded Jamaican planters. They find them a little too ambitious and kind of nasty, and they throw their weight in money around. Um, Though there's obviously, especially among the Whigs, uh, British elites that are very well connected with slavers within the British Empire. But London finance turns to international operations to basically create, through capital investments, monopolies on certain trade goods. So, for example, right, sugar becomes one, coffee is another, and cotton. Right? You can see how all of this develops in a future slide. I'll show you some graphs. But for now, let's get back to the United States. Now, like I said, these South Carolina planters, especially, but Southern planters in general, were very adept at picking up on the new scientific technology of the day. They experiment in crop sciences, right? How can you get a crop that gives a better yield? Can you mix one plant with another to make it more efficient? Et cetera, et cetera. And so South Carolinians had discovered their own varieties of cotton. Eventually, they discover a good form of cotton that grows well in the western uplands of the South, right? So not in the swampy coasts of South Carolina, but as you can see on this map, the dark red and then the lighter red is to a lesser extent. Dark red is really good for cotton. It's really humid. It's wet, but not, it's not literally being submerged in water. And the soil is very, very rich. And so Southerners are expanding. Now, we'll get into the different levels of this. There are elite Southerners who are the billionaires of their day, and then there are more modest Southerners who want to kind of engage in a little bit of the cotton trade, but we'll talk about how that all plays out. But this becomes really important to the expanse of the South, to developing new states further to the west beyond the original 13, right? So you get Tennessee, which has some areas that are better for cotton than others, but you get Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and so on, right? All of these become really important states for developing South, and then of course, right? Oh, the red you can't really see. Let me switch that to a black. You get the eastern part of Texas, which if you've ever been to Texas, is very, very wet and humid. So this is great for cotton. Now the problem with cotton is, as a plant, is that when you harvest it, all throughout it is covered with these sticky seeds, right? The seeds are going to create the new cotton plants, but of course, if you're trying to turn cotton into thread, and you're trying to turn thread into textiles, right, you got to get the seeds out. Now, normally this procedure can only really take place by someone manually removing the seeds, which for the slave, this became a very tedious job. Now, a number of Southern planters started to experiment with it, but it really comes about with a guy named Eli Whitney, who invents the most efficient form of what's called the cotton gin. The cotton gin is basically a mechanical comb. So it will go through the cotton, right? It's powered through a form of electricity, and it will take out all the seeds. Now, the point of this machine for Eli Whitney, who is a little bit of a humanitarian, which maybe is a moral lesson about the best intentions, the road to hell is built with good intentions. But Eli Whitney actually was concerned about the plight of the slaves. He thought this work was really monotonous and boring and kind of hard. So he invented this machine, right? You run the comb, and you can kind of take out the seeds quicker. So this will make the job for the slaves easier, right? If it's more efficient, then they don't have to work as much. Wrong, right? No, this made them more valuable because now the slave can kind of weed through cotton at a much quicker rate, which means, and this doesn't wear him out as much, wear him or her out as much, and so then you can make your slave work longer hours doing an even more monotonous task, running a machine. So, we'll get into this a little bit, but a key takeaway from this is the South is not opposed to industrial technology, right? They're not opposed to machines. They just want this to work for them, right? Which is the production of a raw material like cotton, right? Unlike the North, which will develop giant factories and machines for the production of textiles, which we'll get into in a minute. It's just different, right? They're trying to create a finished project. The South is creating a raw material, but both are interested in industrial technology. Both are interested in science. Both are interested in the highest forms of global finance, as we'll find out. But this really makes slavery valuable again. So even though, right, the British capital has abolished the slave trade, right? Parliament turns against the import and export of slaves, but the investment of London finance into slave economies helps link British wealth, especially among its most elite members, among the aristocracy, to tiny aristocracies in other independent countries. So you have Cuba, which is still part of the Spanish Empire. You have Brazil, which at one point finds a kind of independence by being the seat of the Portuguese monarchy, but eventually becomes an independent country. And then also the U.S. South. So there's, in a sense, you can talk about how the U.S. South becomes sort of a colony for British interests, at least in a sense where they mutually exploit each other. But this helps develop the South as its own kind of economy that's rapidly diverging from other states further north. So you can see on these graphs, right, because of the effects of British capital, Brazil becomes the coffee king of the world, and Brazilian coffee is the most prevalent and cheapest form of coffee that still exists to this day, though not to the extent that it did in the 19th century. You can see Cuba spike up, and then of course U.S. Exports linked to cotton following this trend to British trade. And so all of this has to do with the fact, just to make it really simple, people with money in Great Britain, they take this money and they invest in companies that are involved with the expansion of cotton, coffee, or sugar. They will invest in companies that develop new technologies, not only for the production of these goods, but their transportation. So as we'll see in the creation of railroads throughout the United States in the next lecture, the U.S. South invests in railroads, and British money helps invest in these railroads. But the railroads are designed to get cotton from the western parts of the country to the coast or to some kind of port city, and then you can ship it overseas, either to Great Britain, which was the manufacturer of the world, and we'll get into that in just a second, but also transporting it to the north. Now I want to cover this a little bit. We're going to get more into this next lecture. This is a really complicated topic, and I can't spend too much time on it. But I want to get into basically the contours of the Industrial Revolution. Now, the main impetus for the Industrial Revolution really is cotton. The first major factories, the ones that you sort of maybe you imagine, right, of like the guy just sort of cranking a handle, or something maybe you learned in your high school class about what the Industrial Revolution is. It was all driven by cotton, because all of these factories pumped out textiles, and textiles are clothes, anything, like a cloth good. So drapes, blankets, shirts, pants, socks, you name it, is being produced by cotton. Cotton is a generally kind of comfortable cloth. It's good in the heat. It can be useful in the cold, right? So you don't want to just be wearing sheepskin everywhere. Some of the other kinds of textile goods, like things made from hemp um, or flax, these are not as comfortable. They're not as durable. Um, but and the main thing is they're not as comfortable. But there was a sense where, okay, well, we use hemp or flax because it's easier to weave for the average American home, and because cotton is kind of a hard thing to do and produce unless you got slaves and these kinds of machines. um, so maybe there's a more virtuous path through wearing a kind of rougher cloth. Cotton also looks kind of more shapely when you can produce it. But I won't get into all the fashion elements, but cotton became a real key element in the development of, or it became a key element in the development of British textile manufacturing. So Britain leads the way. There's a whole complicated story. Part of it has to do with the nature of British society, has to do with the nature of British government, and also has to do with the fact that Britain had crazy amounts of coal deposits that were useful for developing the steam engine, and the steam engine becomes the main element for developing these factories. Now, and we'll get into some of this in the next lecture when we talk about technology in the United States and abroad, but the key thing in terms of social transformation about the Industrial Revolution is it took workers who, generally speaking, were self-owned craftspeople who devoted themselves to a skill, right? So you had to actually know how to weave. It took them and put them out of business. Instead, these factories were being manned by people who didn't really require a lot of training. So this is the difference between skilled and unskilled labor. Skilled labor means you got to actually work at it for years and years and years, and then you become an expert, and your expertise kind of allows you to protect your craft and allows you to kind of issue price controls. But for unskilled labor, you could have a guy, the average capitalist, he invests his money, he builds a giant factory, he buys this machinery, and then you don't need to work with these craft guilds, these basically unions of producers. No, you can just hire people who don't know how to do anything. You give them a crash course. It takes about a week to figure out how to work a machine, and all they do is pull a lever or turn something or press a pedal, and then they can pump out shirt after shirt after shirt, right? The effect of this is that the price of goods drops, right? This benefits the consumer, the average shirt and pants, socks, drapes, whatever, the price declines. So now more and more people can buy it. But of course, this comes at a horrible cost. These unskilled laborers work over 70 hours a week. There were no labor laws. There were no social protective nets, right? If you get sick or you get harmed at the job, that's it. You're out on the street. You have to go and kind of beg for the rest of your life, or hopefully a family member can help you. But the more this factory system expanded in Great Britain, the more entire families were swallowed up by this. As you can see in this picture, the factories pumped out horrible toxins. There were no environmental laws. Some of these factories, especially in major northern English cities like Manchester, the skies were literally blackened by the amount of smoke pumped out by these factories from burning coal. And so even during the day, you couldn't see the sun. So social critics would go to these places and would be horrified by the fact that you see these really pasty guys who are barely alive. The British industrial workers' average diet consisted 40% of sugar, which means 40% of their calorie intake came from eating sugar through tea drinking. So, that's like, half of your diet is drinking Coke or energy drinks, right? Not including the rest of what you would eat. So only half of it is just drinks with sugar in them, and then the other half is actual food. So this will make you very sick, but maybe give you enough energy to work 12 to 14-hour days. But not only would men work, women would work. and children would work. And there were some laws trying to be formulated, right? Children cannot work as much as their fathers or mothers. They should go to school and learn something, whether about religion or basic reading skills. But a lot of these factory owners violently opposed any efforts to constrain what they could squeeze out of people. And so you had children working 70, 72 hours a week. Some children in some factories, they would start their day roughly around 5:30 a.m., not including the time it took to wake up and walk to work, and then they would finish their day about 10:30 p.m. Again, not including their travel home and then going to sleep. So, and that was, you'd be working 6, 7 hours or 6, 7 days a week, right? There wasn't necessarily any days off. These factories were believed to be needed to run nonstop. So you're inhaling all this horrible toxins being put out. You're working for 12 to 14 hours a day. Your diet is poor. It's horrible, right? And so a lot of labor reformers um, from both what were called the Tory Party and the Radical Party um, looked at this as a total destruction of British society, destroying free Britons, destroying their rights and liberties within British society, and ultimately making a slave population out of their own people. And so these kinds of critiques will be offered also in the United States for their own industrial revolution that happens later in the 19th century, and we're going to get into that in the next lecture. But Britain has it happen first, and it's nightmarish. And it all depends upon cotton. So one kind of catchy way to remember this is that there's this joint partnership being created. You have the lords of the lash, so the guys who wield the whips and they run the slaves to pump out all the raw cotton. And then you got the lords of the loom, the guys who run these factories, which, it's almost kind of slave-like conditions. You could actually beat your workers too at this time if they stepped out of line or they talked back to you or they were getting kind of lazy or they weren't working as fast as you wanted. You could have a factory overseer clock them in the head and tell them to go back to work. So it was pretty brutal. But both of these groups worked together, revolutionizing the global economy, flooding it with cheap textile goods, which made both the capital owning class, the people who own the factories and own the slaves, as well as the investors in these industries, super wealthy, and giving them a big hook in the control of the political dimensions of their respective countries. Now, another really crazy part about the slave economy was not just the simple production of cotton and its transformation into shirts and pants through the factory industrial system, right? You could actually make a lot of money from slavery, and this is what took place in northern cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, by investing in it as a form of capital, right? So you invest in slavery itself, in the production of slaves, not even the production of cotton. So how did this work out? So one, for example, right, and this is totally bizarre, especially when you think that these are human beings, but you could mortgage a slave. So there are a lot of up and coming wannabe planters, both in the North who moved down south, but also native Southerners. And so you want to get a slave. But slaves are expensive. And they're even more expensive now because you cut off the slave trade from Africa. So now you have slaves within the Southern economy, and they're a more precious good. People become even more invested in thinking on how to make more of them. So literally treating human beings like livestock. So you have this really gross behavior. You might take a very strong, strapping, young enslaved man. They'd be called a buck, and you would ship him around from plantation to plantation, impregnating slave women to try to get uh, better quality slaves. In the same way that you would do this to try to get fatter cattle, so your cows are worth more. The way you would kind of crossbreed plants so that you get a bigger harvest yield. They do this with human persons, right? Human beings shipped around, treated like an animal, right? Now, again, this is expensive, so that you can't, as the average wannabe slave owner, you can't actually buy a slave straight out. But you can go to a bank, and the bank would get you a loan, and so you'd have a mortgage on your slave, and you'd pay off your mortgage, within whatever the pay period is. It's not necessarily monthly, it might be yearly, it might be bi-monthly, it might be every 3 months. I'm sure it varied, but you could get mortgages. And the Second Bank of the United States actually participated in this. So there's if you still have a kind of positive appreciation of what this bank could do, as a private for-profit bank, it was deployed in any industry where it could make money. And so the loans for slaves business seemed to be a good place to get involved. Additionally, slaves could be insured, right? Just like you insure your car or your house or some other piece of property that you have, a slave could be insured, okay, right? What happens if he gets sick? I bought the slave. He's a big capital investment, right? He's supposed to help me farm my cotton. Well, what if he gets hurt? What if he gets sick? What if he dies, right? So you could go through an insurance company um, and get a premium on your slave. And where were these insurance companies located? Places like Philadelphia and New York. Additionally, right, as I mentioned, the internal slave trade of the country became a very lucrative business. So plantation owners themselves would not actually take part in the actual sales of slaves. You would kind of pawn that off to a middleman company where you would sell it to basically a holding company, and then they would travel around the country selling slaves to plantation owners who either want to get started with one or two slaves of their own, or for these mass slave owners, they're just have hundreds if not thousands of slaves working on their plantation. So you go to these and you buy up some higher quality slaves. If you've ever seen any dramatic kind of representations of this process, this is the idea of the slave market. So you pull out the slaves, and then you got guys auctioning for them, right? Oh, this guy looks strong. This guy looks healthy. This woman looks like she could have a lot of children that would be healthy and strong. Whatever. Again, it's treating them just like complete animals. And these middlemen would also double sometimes as banks or insurance companies. So you could buy your slave, get an insurance premium, and maybe the slave trading company would actually help you pay for it by getting you a mortgage. And then, of course, right, the final kind of cherry on top is that you have banks issuing loans for slaves, and processing mortgages. You've got insurance companies offering these premiums. You got the slave trade companies that are the ones moving around buying and selling slaves on an open market. And then, you got the same slave trade companies sometimes double as insurance companies or banks. And sometimes the banking or insurance part overwhelms the slave trading. So there are slave trade companies that eventually just morph into banks. But as corporate entities, as companies, they have stock. They have investors. So if you want to make money, you just buy stock in a bank, buy stock in an insurance company, buy it in a slave trade company. Just think of Wall Street. Think of traders who are on the market buying and swapping stocks as the rate the price of the average piece of stock goes up or down depending on how the company's doing, depending on how issues of slavery and territorial expansion are going. So of course, right, if territory is expanding, if new slave opportunities are going to open up, that makes slavery even more lucrative. So these companies become more valuable because people are more interested in buying and selling slaves, getting insurance on them, and taking out loans from banks. So of course, this is really big business. And this is linked to Northerners, right? It's very clear if you look at a lot of the primary sources that especially New Yorkers, but also people in Philadelphia and Boston, they see common cause with the slavers in the South. Now, of course, this also doubles with the factory owners in the North who are depending upon slave cotton to run their factories and pump out their cheap textile goods. But you'll have speeches even from, one of the more reprehensible characters from this period in the 1850s, a guy named Fernando Wood, who is the mayor of New York City a couple of times as a congressman, and he actually helps fight the 13th Amendment, which is the amendment that makes slavery illegal. But that's all in the future. I mean, Fernando Wood is a representative of New York investors, bankers, financiers, merchants, etc. Right? He says that New York should be committed to defending the South's peculiar institution, which was a sort of euphemism for slavery, and that New York should be twice as strong an advocate for slavery in the United States. Major Whigs, who are kind of much more protective of this arrangement, are called Cotton Whigs. So we already kind of, in the Jackson lecture, and then the Jacksonian lecture, you see Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster is a very strong Cotton Whig. He believes in strong central government. He actually believes in tariffs, which we'll get to in a moment. Um, but he also believes in this strong relationship between the North and the South. Something also Henry Clay believes in. You got to balance these interests so that the slaves of the South can produce the cotton, so the slavers make their killing, their fortune, and then Northern industrialists make their fortune. And it's a partnership. But all of this depends upon the institution of slavery. They don't want to get rid of it, even if they don't want it to spread everywhere. Right? So Northerners, or some of them at least, are highly invested in this, and sometimes, the North can be equally culpable as the South in the development of this financialized slavery, which reduces, right? And we already mentioned, right, in other slave lectures, there's different kinds of slavery. Some forms of slavery are not permanent, they're not racialized, they're not linked to some kind of idea that you're inferior by nature, right? You're just captured, and so the rest of your life you have to serve as a slave. But as we saw in other elements, right, slavery, you could do pretty well for yourself as a slave, right? And this reflects more of an ancient view of slavery. But there's also incredibly brutal forms of ancient slavery, and this really morphed in the American period where slavery is just treating people like pieces of property, like a car, like a home, or like a livestock, a cow or a pig or a sheep. Um, that you use to produce incredible amounts of money. Now you have this that's the underpinnings of the actual system. This is a kind of overlay generalized approach to actually how the system worked. What was really happening. But if you might expect, if you know anything about human nature, a lot of people who do bad things don't really like to think that they're the bad guy, right? Very few people are willing to own that they're just strictly evil. I do this because I just do it for myself. To hell with everyone else. I know it's wrong, but I don't care, right? It benefits me, it helps me, it makes me more powerful, right? Some people almost approach that level of kind of demonic arrogance, to use a certain kind of phrase. But a lot of people feel uncomfortable with this, right? They think, no, I'm not a bad person. This is the right way to do things. So one instance of this, right, is what I'm calling the Southern American dream, right? Is this idea that owning the slave is part of being an American. Now, throughout this period, right, you might expect that most Southerners own slaves, but it's actually the opposite. 3/4 of Southerners don't own any slaves. So only 25% ever own any slaves. And there's only a tiny fraction of that 25%, this is the equivalent of like the 1% of the 0.01% who own massive plantations, right? Most Southerners who own slaves, of that 25%, they only own somewhere between 1 and 4 slaves. And this was part of this idea, though. So what keeps the 3/4, the 75%, still invested in a system? Why do they vote for the increasingly slave party atmosphere of the Democrats? Or why do they support more conservative Whigs that want to defend slavery? The reason they want to do this is because they believe that they too one day will get to participate in this. And so there was a kind of idea that one day I'll get my slave or get 2 or 3 slaves, I'll get my own little farm, I'll grow subsistence agriculture, right? So I can provide food for me and my family. And then maybe I'll grow a little cotton on the side. That's my side hustle. I get my cotton to market. I get some extra cash. I can use that to maybe make my house a little fancier. I can invest in other things, kind of move up the ranks, right? I'll leave my home to my children, and or I'll help them get started in buying their own home and their own land and setting up their own kind of farm with their own couple of slaves. And it's like I want my children to do better than I did. But of course, this is all linked to the slave economy, right? So one way is like I'm trying to think about my family. I'm trying to invest in my future, and for that 75% that don't own slaves, um, a big chunk of them are not going to be opposed to slavery. They're just seeing themselves as not yet slave owners, right? One day I'll be a slave owner. In the same way that someone might say, one day I'm going to own my own home, so I want to vote for policies that protect homeowners. Maybe that disadvantages people who don't own homes, but nevertheless, right, you keep investing in the system. Another element to this, right, was already touched on, is many Southerners viewed themselves as gentlemen. Um, the Southern culture had an interesting attraction to feudal ideas of knights and ladies, right? This idea that you build your own little family with his own coat of arms, basically becoming a kind of nobleman, and therefore living your life is about building up your own brands, protecting your family's honor. So the South still maintains this knightly duel culture. So if you insult someone's honor, he might challenge you to a duel. Of course, this is illegal both in Europe and the United States, but still goes on. But this is all kind of dabbling in fantasy. It's like going to Renaissance fairs and stuff, and dressing like you're this kind of person that you're not. Additionally, right, Southern elites were deeply fascinated with British aristocratic culture, so they wanted to dress in the best styles that Great Britain's nobility dressed in. And so part of all this was seeing themselves as lords and the slaves as kind of serfs, right? They saw themselves as feudal lords, and so they believed that they were doing better for their slaves. Um, these ideas that the slaves were basically adult children. All right, to quote one slave theorist, who we're going to get into a little bit later, he says, quote, "He, the Negro, is but a grown-up child and must be governed as a child, not as a lunatic or criminal. The master occupies toward him the place of parent or guardian." So that's this idea, right? That's just one example of a common idea of paternalism, which is basically that the black man, the African, is just by nature inferior. He's not capable of doing math. He's not capable of doing science. He's not capable of real complex emotional thought. Not capable of philosophy or poetry. His lot in life is to labor, so that to free up the superior race, the white man, so that he can actually engage in these works. John C. Calhoun, right, he will talk about the very fact that any serious society, any successful and rich civilization will be built upon the idea of one group owning another group, right? So he says, "I hold then," this is a quote, "I hold then that there never has yet existed a wealthy and civilized society in which one portion of the community did not, in point of fact, live on the labor of others." Right? Broad and general as this assertion is, it is fully borne out by history. Right? So what better way to set up your system than to pick an inferior race, one that's not capable of these higher goods, and enslave them and depend upon their labor for your own wealth and success, so that you can go on living the life of a gentleman who's devoted to high culture, the arts, philosophy, technology, science, etc., right? Now, of course, right, if this racialized approach is false, then the whole thing crumbles down. But that's how John C. Calhoun saw things. He believed the South was the greatest civilization to ever exist, and that the United States needed slavery if it was going to be a great country. Unlike Europeans who had enslaved their own fellow man through serfdom, unlike Romans who had enslaved other Europeans, which were equally superior to them, to the Greeks or Romans who were enslaving them, John C. Calhoun said, right, no, the Americans have figured it out perfectly because we've enslaved the race that actually likes to do this kind of work. And they're not capable of taking care of themselves. So we take care of them. We provide them food, shelter, clothing. We kind of tuck them into bed at night and tell them stories, kiss them on the forehead and say goodnight. And then we get into the hard work of politics, business, global trade, philosophy, and production of a beautiful, deep, rich, and powerful, and interesting civilizations, right? So that's how they justified it to themselves, right? In short, right, they like it. They want to be slaves. They can't actually do it on their own. And so, therefore, people who are advocating and agitating against the institution of slavery are basically trying to overturn the natural order of things. So they're going against nature. And so a lot of these Southerners, right, they're invested in these agricultural technologies. And so they take to these very pernicious theories that the world is built on racial hierarchy. Um, Man is not, equally made in the image of God. There's actually a slow morphing of the traditional Christian view among some Southerners, that no, God didn't make all men. He evolved nature in particular different pathways, and he evolved the white man to rule and govern and to be the top caste, and then he evolved the black man to be at the bottom, kind of working and slaving away. But this ultimately says, hey, you got to own slaves because it's the natural order of things. You can't, to free them is to basically put them on their own. So actually, I'm a good person by owning and keeping slaves and by continuing on this institution. But as I said, right, not everyone got to participate in this, and so some Southerners actually were not sure about how to imagine a South that existed with poor whites, right? You have the owners, right? They have the slaves, they have the plantations, and then you got the slaves themselves. But what do you do with this middle group, right? These poor whites are free, but they're not wealthy, and they live lives basically equivalent to the average slave. So this is where the term cracker comes from. A cracker is somebody who's basically a poor dirt farmer, doesn't own any slaves, barely getting by, uncultured, uncivilized, and by Southern patrician standards as kind of a degenerate. So um, there's not really a place for them. Of course, some of these people aspire to this American dream of owning a slave their own, owning a slave one day on their own. Um, but of course, some of these people are also anti-slave and very bitter and jaded. Now we'll get to this when we talk about the know nothings in the next lecture, but actually, just because there's this ironic juxtaposition, they don't want slavery because they believe in the superiority of the white race, and black slaves are taking jobs from white free poor people, right? So there's a kind of interesting overlay of how slavery can be opposed in lots of different ways. It doesn't necessarily mean racial equality, but we'll get into more of that in the next lecture. Now I want to jump in real quick. Let's not spend too much time, but some Southern slave theorists, so unlike John C. Calhoun, they kind of go to an incredibly radical conclusion about the nature of slavery. And they're not very popular, but they do reflect kind of the weird dimensions of how this idea about paternalism and about the need for slavery to build a great civilization, and actually turning it around and criticizing the North as being a degenerate, backwards society. Right. So John C. Calhoun is probably the greatest political philosopher and the greatest exponent of slavery, at least in the mainstream. He's this elite South Carolinian, as you kind of saw in the Jackson documentary. He becomes, he at one point is a supporter of Jackson, but then he turns on Jackson over the issue of tariffs. And the importance of tariffs, right? Tariffs are taxed on imported goods from other countries. Was that the South built its society on the free exchange of goods. They'd send cotton over to Britain, and Britain would send textiles and other luxury goods back to the South. So if there were tariffs, this would increase the price on consumers for all sorts of goods that they wanted to buy from Great Britain. So part of the South sort of way of life depended on this radically broken down idea of free trade, which will benefit the Southern planter. But George Fitzhugh, on the other hand, is kind of a wild man when it comes to slave theory. John C. Calhoun will critique the North, but George Fitzhugh will actually consider the North to basically be a worse form of a slave society than the South. Fitzhugh will talk about how in the North, the factory owners, which are basically a kind of slave owner, but one that's sort of dodging his responsibilities, right? Rather than nursing his poor factory worker back to health, like I said, there's no social safety net. So if a factory worker gets hurt, he's just kind of fired, and then he's left on his own to sort of fend for himself, right? And so when you work in these factories, there are no OSHA laws. There's no government oversight on whether this is a safe environment or any kind of training to prevent misuses of these machines. Well, maybe training to prevent breaking the machines, but you know, if you lose a finger or an arm or a toe or a leg in the machine, right? That's just a problem you just got to deal with. And so lots of factory workers lost ligaments to these industrial machines. So Fitzhugh looks at this and says, this is horrible, right? In the South, if a slave gets hurt, the master has a responsibility as a good gentleman, as a good paternalist, to nurse his slave back to health because it's like his child, right? You don't, when your child gets sick, you don't throw him out of the house because he can't clean the dishes anymore. You just, you help him and you get him back on his feet. You provide for him. So that's how Fitzhugh said, right? The North would actually be better off if the factory owners enslaved their factory workers. That would be better for them because at least the factory owner would then have an incentive to provide for them. Fitzhugh, like Calhoun, argues that inequality is built into the fabric of civilization, right? So this idea that all men are created equal is a lie, right? How did the pyramids get built? Slaves. How did ancient Greece, Athens, Sparta, how did they become so powerful? Slaves. How did ancient Rome dominate the entire Mediterranean world? Slaves. How did Western Europe develop its wealth? Serfs, which are basically slaves. China had slaves. India had slaves. Everywhere, right? The Islamic empires of Africa were built on buying and selling slaves. Now, as we mentioned, there are different kinds of slavery, but that's not really the point for Fitzhugh. The point is that inequality is the natural state of things. Trying to create equality actually destroys the fabric of society. So, therefore, if you're going to do slavery, you got to do it right. And in fact, for Fitzhugh, the South conceptualized almost as an independent nation, unlike the North, a totally different place. The South exhibits the best form of society. Inequality is inevitable, but if you manage it properly, it works for everyone. And this goes to the point where maybe some of you will find this strange, maybe some of you won't care, but Fitzhugh actually compares it to communism. So this is a quote from one pamphlet he wrote. He says, quote, "One of the wildest sects of communists in France proposes not only to hold all property in common, but to divide the profits not according to each man's input and labor, but according to each man's wants." Now, this is precisely the system of domestic slavery with us. We provide for each slave, in old age and in infancy, in sickness and in health, not according to his labor, but according to his wants. The master's wants are most costly and refined, and he therefore gets a larger share of the profits. A southern farm is the beau ideal of communism. It is a joint concern in which the slave consumes more than the master of the coarse products, and is far happier, because although the concern may fail, he is always sure of a support. He is only transferred to another master to participate in the profits of another concern. He marries when he pleases because he knows he will have to work no more with a family than without one, and whether he live or die, that family will be taken care of. He exhibits all the pride of ownership, despises a partner in a smaller concern. A poor man's Negro boasts of our crops, horse, fields, and cattle, and is as happy as a human being can be. Right? So, this might be total bullshit. This might be a complete fabrication of what actually takes place. But this is how some people are actually theorizing it. And that's why Fitzhugh will go on to actually say, hey, you know how you solve the problem of poor whites in the South? Just enslave them. They'll be happy. They'll be, he has sort of views of racial inferiority, but guess what? Poor whites are basically a racially inferior group, because if they weren't racially inferior, they wouldn't be poor, now would they? So Fitzhugh is sort of shunted to the side of polite society. He's a Virginian, but these views are even too wild for a lot of Southerners. So, but that's just to give you a sense of how crazy things could get. Now, another element which affects not just the masters but slaves was the role of evangelical Christianity throughout the South. Next lecture, we're going to get a lot more into this, what the Second Great Awakening is, but it sees the explosion of a lot of lay preachers, mainly Baptists and Methodists, if you know what groups those are. If you don't, you can quickly look them up on Wikipedia or something, just so you know. I'll explain more about them in another lecture, but we won't get into too much. But the idea was that for these groups especially, and from the ripple effects of the Second Great Awakening, there was an emphasis put on the need to live a good life, to live a holy life, and to get the message of God's word out to as many people as possible, which included slaves, right? Evangelicals, even the ones that supported slavery, and there were plenty of Southern evangelicals who supported slavery, who owned slaves, but they did not deny the humanity of the slave. So paternalism might see the slave as basically an adult child, incapable of growing up, but he was still a human being. He was still a child. He still needed God's word. Now, evangelicalism could develop in a lot of different ways. In the South, it could help defend and protect the master class interests, right? The master as this lordly figure, he has a responsibility to care for his childlike manservant and woman servant. And so therefore he needs to bring the gospel to them. He needs to teach them about Christianity and teach them about what God has done for them. But this would also spread among enslaved people and free black people, both North and South, and develop, what's called black Christianity, which was a form of Christianity that developed sort of apart, at least institutionally, from other groups and churches within the United States. So some free and enslaved black men and women joined other groups that white people participated in, and some of them kind of separated off and did their own thing. So some churches that exist today have their origin as splitting from one group and basically creating a white denomination of Methodists and a black denomination of Methodists, white Baptists and black Baptists, both North and South. But the segregation, at least at this religious level, what it allowed the black folks to do is sort of take control of their own lives and take control of their own teaching of God's word. So you saw the rise of black preachers who would travel from plantation to plantation, evangelizing and preaching from the Bible. Some of them were free. Most of them were actually slaves, but they would be able to go off and do this because their master would see that there's a positive good in this. But as slavery continued and deepened in the South, efforts were made to restrain black preachers. So in the early 19th century, you got black preachers who were kind of off doing their own thing, but then there was worry that what are these black preachers going to teach? Are they going to teach to defend the institution of slavery, or are they going to undermine it? And if you remember from a past lecture, I mentioned Gabriel's revolt. In Gabriel's mind, right, he was a lay Methodist preacher. We see in Denmark Vesey's approach, or Denmark Vesey's attempted rebellion, he was a lay Methodist preacher. And they believed that what God wanted was to free the slaves. So while Southern evangelicals wanted the slaves to hear parts of the Bible that emphasized the need for slaves to obey their masters and to respect them, black preachers would not actually do that, right? They would promote respectability. They would say, look, slaves, if you're a slave, you got to honor your master. Your master's a human being. He's also has God's image, even if he's doing the wrong thing. But you would also have to see yourself and your master within the context of the story of Exodus. If you don't know what Exodus is, it's worth looking up in Wikipedia. It's a book of the Bible, but it's generally the story is God's people, Israel, the Jews, they found themselves going down to Egypt. The Egyptians enslaved the Jews. Uh, God eventually raises up one of their number, a man named Moses, who becomes the leader and the prophet for the nation of Israel. He brings down the Ten Commandments from Mount Sinai, and among other things that maybe you're not familiar with. But the story of Exodus, Moses goes to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go." Right? Thus says the Lord, "Let my people go and let them worship me on their own." Of course, Pharaoh says no. Moses initiates God's judgment against Egypt. So there's the 10 plagues, right? Eventually climaxing with the death of the firstborn. This is where the holiday of Passover comes from. If whether or not you're Jewish or you're familiar with that holiday, um, it's also linked to the how Jesus Christ sees himself in the New Testament and how Christians develop their own ideas. So this is linked to Easter, which is the same time as Passover, where Jesus saw himself as the Passover lamb being sacrificed to protect God's people against the coming wrath, right? The destruction of evil, the destruction of bondage and slavery, and so on. And therefore, right, God leads his people. He leads them out of Egypt, and Pharaoh's armies are destroyed. Right, this is the separation of the waters in the Red Sea, and he leads them to the promised land, a land flowing over with milk and honey. Right, that's how the Bible depicts it. That's the symbols they use. Slaves read this story and see themselves directly in it. Right, the white slave owners are like Pharaoh. They won't let God's people, black Christians, enslaved Christians, go and worship him rightly. He won't let them be free. So there's a lot of what are called Negro spirituals, the songs that are created by and sung among black Christians in the South. They're all about God's coming judgment, right? God's going to do something. He's going to free his people. Some of them are a lot more sad, right? God's going to free his people, but maybe the only freedom we'll ever have is in death, right? We'll die, we'll go to heaven, and we'll escape these chains forevermore. But some of these approaches, they tended to be much stronger, right? There is going to be a historical judgment. God is going to pour down his wrath, right? In like the book of Revelation, right? God's going to come, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. He's going to wipe out these evildoers and free his people. So this guy here, his name is David Walker. He was a Methodist pastor, and he wrote a book, a pamphlet that was banned in the South from circulating, which basically said slavery is a horrible sin in the United States, and unless Americans purge it themselves, God is going to purge it with an ocean of blood, right? And for some people looking back, you could say, oh, the Civil War was basically the fulfillment of this, right? Lots and lots of people died. Millions of Americans die, both at defending and attacking the institution of slavery. Now, the war is not formally about this, but for someone like David Walker, if he had lived to see this moment, he would probably think that that's what's actually happening. God's wrath is finally being manifested, where every drop of blood that the slave owner had taken from the slave is now going to be brought back upon the nation. So David Walker is basically preaching a hellfire message, right? Turn or burn, right? United States, you have a choice. You can get off the path of slavery, or you're going to be forcibly ripped off of this path. Now, David Walker thought maybe even the United States would get blown up as a country. There would be nothing left. But this shows you kind of the extent to what Christianity could do. For some, right, it was a way of getting slaves to conform to the institution that bound them, right? Slaves, obey your masters. So you got to listen, right? You got to be a good person. You got to know your place in society. But the Bible also could provide the context for slaves to hope for a world outside of slavery, to not be totally destroyed, and to not fully lose their humanity, even as they are rapidly being dehumanized, whether through the whip, through rape, through being bought and sold like animals. Some slave owners, right, respected their slaves. They allowed them to get married. They kind of, maybe they treated them like children, but they kind of let them you know, live their own lives as long as they could put in the work. Other slave owners, right, they're livestock, they're animals, and so slave owners would break up families, they would sell children. There are horrible stories of slave owners raping their slaves. There's actually one of the most brutal stories is that, and this, even this was beyond the pale for American society, was that there was a Virginian politician, and it was known that not only was he having sex with one of his slaves, but he had a daughter with her. When the daughter was old enough, he started sleeping with her too. So just, and that was his career was over at that point. But the ugliness and the brutality of it was met by enslaved black Christians with this idea that no, God's judgment may come and liberate us one of these days, right? Now, another key element to this, and there's more in the textbook you can see about this, was how slavery was being made not just to be a Southern society issue, not just slavery as an economic issue, and not just slavery as a state issue, but the future of the federal government's role in slavery was becoming more and more of a hot button issue. And this was in no case clearer than the issue of the Amistad. Now, real quick, the story is the Amistad was a Spanish slave ship. It had all of these slaves on board. The slaves, they throw a mutiny. They kill their their prison guards, and they take the boat captain hostage. And they tell him, sail us back. Now, don't take us to Cuba. Take us to, back home. Take us to Africa. So the ship, plays this game. During the day, they kind of sail east, but then when it's nighttime and most of these enslaved people are asleep, they start sailing back west. Um, the enslaved people obviously start getting mad because they think, where are we? Where are you going? Are you actually taking us where we want to go? But eventually, the Amistad will kind of crash into the into the United States. In the United States, the slaves are taken off the boat, but the issue becomes, are these people free or are they slaves, right? They had landed in a free state where slavery was formally illegal, but should the slaves be packed back up on a boat and sent overseas and kind of put back in bondage? At the time, Martin Van Buren is president. Martin Van Buren is not a strong believer in slavery himself, but he believes that he cannot separate slavery from the Democratic Party. That for the future of the Democrats depends upon keeping the North and the South together. The South depends upon slavery. It argues very strongly for slavery. John C. Calhoun will kind of oscillate back and forth, but he will remain a very solid Democrat. The Democratic Party, mainly because of the efforts of people like John C. Calhoun, will become the party of the slave owners. But even though Martin Van Buren doesn't like that, he knows that slavery is an inevitable phenomenon within United States society. So he actually helps lead the charge to get the slaves back on the boat being sent overseas. Now, ultimately, right, the court will find in favor of the escaped slaves, right? They will sue for their freedom, and there's a movie about this. This guy here, right? Anthony Hopkins plays John Quincy Adams, which, as we talked about in a previous lecture, after his presidency, he will become a member of Congress. He will be elected at first under the anti-Mason party, which we'll explain more in another lecture, but then he'll become a solid Whig. But he opposes the administration, and John Quincy Adams, throughout his career as a congressman, becomes very strongly in favor of ending slavery. There's a whole issue about him reading petitions from slaves, and there's some funny stories from that. One of the congressmen, Democrats in Congress and slave owners in Congress do not want to read petitions from slaves in Congress. They think this is outrageous. But John Quincy Adams does something funny one time. He finds a petition from a slave, whether real or fictional, it's not clear, where the slave is asking Congress to defend slavery because slavery is really great. Now, the congressman in question who starts opposing John Quincy Adams starts going off and off and off about how it's totally improper to be reading petitions from slaves. We need to put a gag order on Quincy Adams. He just keeps reading these petitions. Then John Quincy Adams reads the petition, And the congressman changes his mind. Oh no, well maybe that one wasn't so bad. But it became this game, obviously revealing the hypocrisy that you can welcome petitions from slaves if they defend the institution of slavery, but if they attack the institution of slavery, then it's out of bounds, right? Which is clearly politicizing it, a legal issue, and trying to use bureaucratic formality to lock out actual debates. So John Quincy Adams was very much against slavery, and he spent the last decades of his career increasingly pushing against it. And one way he does that is by supporting this cause. He's one of the lawyers who participated in this suit against against those who want to put the freed people back into bondage. And this only creates, right, the favorable cause in favor, or the favorable cause for the slaves only raises the stakes. It raises the temperature, right? If the federal government can make this decision, right, a federal court deciding to basically uphold abolition, at least in the state of New York, which is where I believe that the case is tried. If it can decide that, what else could the federal government decide? Could it ultimately decide to wipe out the institution of slavery, as we saw with something like the Wilmot Proviso, which comes after this case? You have the federal government trying to pursue a bill, right? David Wilmot trying to push this bill in Congress, which is ultimately defeated. But you see a popular outpouring in Congress in support of restricting the expansion of slavery. Eventually, this will give rise to a new party system in the United States, but it makes the federal government a clear agent of change. The federal government could either entrench slavery or expand it, or it could end it. And so both Southerners and Northerners become interested in trying to get control of the federal government to pursue one of these two options. So just to forecast, right, the South will ultimately secede, provoking the Civil War. But part of the reason they secede is because they start to realize they can't get control of the federal government anymore. Their interests are losing out. And so it's not really about states' rights. States' rights is a convenient tool to defend the issues of slavery at a federal level. But nevertheless, right, the Amistad case really heightens the issues. It makes slavery a federal issue now and becoming the dominant political issue for Congress and for the president to engage in. Now that's basically where I want to leave things in terms of the lecture, but I want to shift over to talk about Frederick Douglass and the text that you're going to be reading. The section for the text you're going to be reading for this week, it's part of his autobiography, his experiences as a slave. Right, so this is a picture of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is one of the more interesting thinkers and writers in American history. Frederick Douglass, he escaped slavery. He grew up in Maryland. He escapes to the North eventually. And he will be a participant in abolition societies. Now, we'll discuss a little bit this more in the next lecture. Douglass doesn't quite fit in with a lot of abolitionists who have a very lachrymose, dramatic account of slavery, where the slaves, because of the effects of slavery, reduce them to basically being subhuman. They're really messed up, right? You will go through all these horrible experiences, and so it's up to us Northerners to prevent anything worse from happening and to kind of liberate these slaves so that, they stop becoming, basically broken individuals. The problem with Frederick Douglass was that he was anything but a broken individual. He was articulate. He taught himself how to read and write. He went on the political circuit. He will become an advocate for women's rights to vote. He will become an advocate for the illegality of slavery. He will become a firm supporter of Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party, and he will keep trying to push them further and further towards the issue of abolition, when sometimes they seem to hedge their bets on it, because there were many members of the Republican Party who do not want to take a totally destructive view of slavery. Maybe they want to restrict how it expands, but they do not want to interfere in Southern life. Frederick Douglass will push Lincoln and Republicans to embrace a more radical dimension of this. So in this autobiography, it's not so much a sob story, but how Frederick Douglass develops as a man. So the section I have you read is probably the most philosophically interesting part of the entire thing. I want to go over two elements to help you understand the at least why this is more than just an account of okay, here's just another slave. He's being brutalized by the slave system, and and so on, right? Rather, I want you to understand generally how Frederick Douglass, as a philosopher, basically kind of processes this stuff. So one element of this is what I'm calling the identity of the subject, right? And this is a question of basically, who are you, right? What does it mean to be you? For Frederick Douglass, this process develops through his experiences with slavery. So I've asked classes in the past before the question, when is Frederick Douglass free? And most people don't actually, at least a lot of the people who were reading the text, they weren't reading it carefully enough, they weren't reading it slowly enough, or at least they weren't thinking about this question in any substantial way. So they type in their search bar, Frederick Douglass free. They find the part of the biography that says, okay, he jumped on a train in this particular year. He got these fake documents that said he was free. So he's able to pass from Maryland into Pennsylvania, which was free state territory. And so from there, he could just escape further to the north. Boom. That's when Douglass was free. But that's not what Douglass says. Douglass does not say that he was free in the substantial definition of the term when he gets on a train and escapes over the border. Rather, freedom is something that's inward. Freedom is not something, oh, I don't have bonds on me. There's no external pressure making me be one way or the other. No, freedom is a state of mind. So Douglass actually, when you look at this account, and this is when he says how he became a free man, he basically draws, whether intentionally or unintentionally, on contemporary work from a German philosopher named Hegel. Now, what Hegel believed was how subjectivity is defined is by being confronted with a contrast. So for Hegel, it's the relationship between the master and the slave. The master looks at a slave, right? And he's talking about the ancient world. He's talking about ancient Greece and Aristotle. When the master looks at the slave, he sees someone that basically looks like him, right? In a lot of cases, slaves were victims of war, right? So you beat one people, a neighboring tribe, a neighboring city, a neighboring country in a battle. And so rather than killing off the entire army, right, the person defeated makes a deal. He says, don't kill me. You can inflict upon me a kind of social death. I don't exist as a person anymore in your society, but I get to keep living on. And this is the origin for Hegel of slavery. And Hegel's not alone in theorizing it. But what Hegel does is try to understand how human subjectivity arises, and basically this self-consciousness of knowing yourself as a human being. So being able to think about yourself in a complex way where you can imagine yourself not just as one among many, but being aware of your ability, the ability to even think about that. So how does this come about? For Hegel, the slave owner looks upon the slave, and he kind of sees this inferior subject, and so he's able to define himself as a person, which is literally, what a gentleman is, right? Gentes in Latin, I already explained this. Gentes in Latin means a nation or a people. So literally being a person is being able to kind of hold yourself up at a certain caste and seeing the slave. Similarly, the slave is able to look at the master, and maybe he wants to overcome the master, remove the master, become a master himself, or perhaps implement his own kind of way of life for society, a society of masterless slaves, right? Get rid of the master class, and so slaves can all kind of participate in keeping themselves afloat as this laboring people, right? The master gets to own, and therefore he can work on higher pursuits, and the slave has to do the grunt work. But this is a whole complicated thing. I'm not going to teach you about Hegelian dialectics or continental philosophy or even how to understand Hegel. But the point of the lord-slave or the master-slave binary is that It's only being confronted with someone like you but not you that you become aware of yourself as a free agent in the world. So for Frederick Douglass, this process happens when he's confronted by the slave breaker. So in the story, you're going to read, right, Frederick Douglass gets sick. He's kind of, he hasn't quite lost himself as a young man. And so his owner sends him to a guy who says, guaranteed 1 year with me, this guy will be compliant, docile, and he'll stop being snarky, he'll stop talking back, he'll stop being sarcastic or ironic. He will just be like a machine. So Douglass goes off. He's really severely beaten. He becomes really sick under this overseer. This guy is really crafty and kind of perverse in some ways. There's some bizarre elements of how he tries to sneak up on slaves to surprise them, to kind of create this environment of paranoia. But when he finally gets into this confrontation with this guy, this is the moment, Douglass says, that I became free. When he realizes his own power, he grabs his slave breaker by the throat, and this man who's reduced to kind of basically an animal force that's been overcome by someone who can recognize his own humanity. So in some ways, Frederick Douglass is taking this Hegelian view of the subject and pursuing it in his own ways of how the slave becomes a master of himself, right? Douglass is no longer subject to the whims of other men, but instead he now owns himself. He's free. And he calls this literally a resurrection of his spirit, right? He was dead, but now he's alive. He was a slave, but now he's free, and no one can bind his soul, right? That's the base, no one can restrict his conscience. He's a free man. He can perceive the world, and now that he's free on the inside, he felt now capable and equipped to actually pursue freedom on the outside. So this is how a human person is born, right? At least his awareness of being a free subject, being confronted with basically an animal hostile force, which Douglass sees in the slave breaker, somebody driven by frenzy, by rage, by passionate emotion, somebody who's not even reflecting on who he himself is in the world. But Frederick Douglass recognizes this in himself by overcoming the slave master. He finally stands up against him, and he says he wilts like a leaf, right? This hurricane is just immediately stopped, and Frederick Douglass assumes his own humanity in this moment. This might be too heady for some of you. This is a very philosophically rich passage, but it's worth reflecting on. And if any of you are interested in philosophy, this is you're never going to get this from a philosophy professor. No one thinks of Frederick Douglass as a Hegelian. No one thinks him as a philosophically rich writer or author, but you can see this kind of rich approach in how he talks about himself in becoming a man and becoming a free subject. Another element that Frederick Douglass introduces in the passages that I'm having you read is, how does social control work? So Frederick Douglass has this very interesting passage about Christmas. So, Frederick Douglass says, slave masters think themselves generous, and many other people in the country think that they're generous and benevolent because they'll have Christmas parties for their slaves, right? One time of the year for about a week, the masters will give slaves time off. They'll buy them a bunch of food and alcohol and kind of let them go nuts. Now, Frederick Douglass sees this as an incredibly sinister ploy, right? What happens during these Christmas celebrations? Well, the slave masters, they buy all this food and drink, that's true, but they encourage the slaves to excess. They gamble on food eating competitions. They'll get one slave to drink more than another, right? These slaves will get, they'll party for like 10 to, it's like the 12 days of Christmas, right? So they got 12 days off. They're partying nonstop for 12 days. They're getting drunk every night. They're hooking up with girls, or girls are hooking up with guys, or whatever's taking place. There's sex going on. There's drinking. There's eating. There's partying. And then after 12 days, they're overwhelmed, right? They're oversatisfied, right? They have hangovers, they feel fat and bloated, and these slaves now say, "Oh man, this parties was great, but I got to get back to work, right? I've had my fill. Now I can go back to work as a slave. For Frederick Douglass, this is what he considers, and that's why I have an image of it, a safety valve. The safety valve, if you know anything about steam technology, is that it's supposed to let off some of the excess steam so that when a boiler is so overperforming, the boiler doesn't explode, right? The steam valve is to let out some of this energy that's overproduced and not necessary for the functions of the technology. Um, that's it's not necessary for the technology to fully function, right? Sometimes if you do too much, right, you overload a system. So the steam valve of the Christmas celebration is supposed to let off, this is where the expression comes from, let off some steam, right? You let off some steam so that the slaves are not pushed into a kind of state of mind where they say, look, the only thing I have to lose is my chains, life is miserable, I might as well just fight and die for my freedom because I can't keep going on. Instead, the Christmas celebration, it gives something for slaves to look forward to. They're working for the weekend, basically. And then when they go through it, not only do they then become satisfied to go back to work, but it has this subtle psychological effect to convince slaves that look at you. You're fat, you're drunk, you're banging all these people, right? How is this, how are you going to be a free person doing all this crap, right? Look at you. You can't take care of yourself. You're a slob. You're disgusting, right? Aren't you glad that I put you back to work? If I didn't put you back to work, you'd never be able to take care of yourself because you're too much of an animal. You're too crazy, and you need someone like me, the slave owner, the slave driver, or whatever, to kind of get you back on the right track. Without me, your life would be miserable. And so, therefore, Douglass sees this as all of a piece. No, this is not benevolence. This is investing in the future of slavery. Yes, you give a few days off, but it's so that you can get the whole rest of the year and you can keep your slaves as an efficient workforce. If your workforce is unhappy, if they have nothing to look forward to, it's just brutality after brutality after brutality, maybe you'll break some people, but you might just sort of reduce them to shells of themselves where they have no reason to work harder. But if they think, oh man, I might get a Christmas bonus at the end of the year, Master's going to buy me a ham, Master's going to buy me a bottle of rum, right? He's going to allow me to party, he's going to bring slaves from other plantations, so you get to meet new people, make new friends, so on and so forth. This ultimately breaks your spirit because you get invested in the system of slavery. You're convinced that you can't actually be free, and that the seriousness of a devout life, whether you define that religiously in terms of Christianity or just trying to be a virtuous person committed to a higher cause than your own stomach and your own self-interest, this wipes all of this out. So Frederick Douglass sees this as this insidious way of keeping people slaves, right? Not just externally, right? They give them a little bit of vacation time, they get to be free, but it only tightens the chains of their own internal slavery. A slavery to their own emotions, a slavery to their own passions, a slavery to their own desires, and then being convinced that as a slave of these desires, they are fundamentally unfit to be free. So it's actually a pretty precise commentary on lots of social control mechanisms that I'm sure you can draw analogies to today, right? What do corporate environments do? Are they always benevolent when they do, things for their workers? What are some of the things, right? If, maybe a helpful rule of thumb is if you look at the things that a massive, major, dominant corporation, say Amazon, if you look at the things that they support, maybe that will tell you the things that are actually toothless or things that ultimately keep people in their chains. And if you look at the things that they are violently against, then it will tell you about like actual threats to the system of profit, right? And so maybe some of you love Amazon, maybe you think, I'm sure lots of you order things from Amazon, but Amazon's wealth over the past 9 months has doubled. Amazon is wiping out small businesses. Now that might be a good thing. That might be a horrible thing. I would say it's the latter. Um, but you got to look at this thing. You got to look at how these mechanisms of control work. How do they reduce people from a state of freedom into a state of internal bondage? That's what Frederick Douglass wants to look at. That's what he sees in the system of slavery. And as we'll talk about in later lectures, slavery extends beyond literally keeping people in bondage. Chattel slavery in the South is perhaps one of the most egregious and evil, I would say, in making a moral judgment, forms of this, but it's a system that exists elsewhere. As we talked about in the British industrial system, some factory reformers saw the factory system as Britain's own form of slavery. And United States factory workers in the North will start to view things in a similar way. And we're going to talk about that more in the next lecture. So until then, this is John Parks. This is your lecturer for History 113. Go in peace and keep hanging in there.